So hi, welcome to the education panel. It will be educational and it will be a panel. Just a little show of hands, and I can kind of see into the audience. How many people learned how to think in school in a formal learning environment? I can see, let's see. Oh, good. Oh, okay. Can I just have you put your elbows above your ears so I can actually see it? Okay. How many people learned how to think outside of school? Okay, so that's the vast majority of you. How many people had someone pull you aside and say, hey, you're kind of smart. Let me teach you a little bit about how to think about the world? Oh, like 4 of you. Okay. So it seems like most of you taught yourself how to think critically. Okay, good. So I had this sort of interesting experience when I first started teaching. I know a number of you went to the Story Collider last night, and I heard it went really well. Well, I gave a, yay, Story Collider. Well, I gave a Story Collider talk a couple weeks, months ago now about what it's like to teach sex ed to a bunch of pregnant kids. I should have had them when they were in 9th grade. I had them when they were in 10th grade and got themselves in trouble. But as I was really listening to the podcast a couple weeks ago, it was really painful to hear myself talk. And I was thinking about what I was going to say here. I thought, you know, it was really dangerous for me to say words like penis and vagina in a really religiously conservative town where I had a lot of people looking at me about what I was talking about in my classroom. But actually, as I was thinking about sort of critical thinking in education and the role of critical thinking in a very conservative town, I actually was thinking quite fondly to what it was like, instead of teaching the reproductive system, to actually teaching evolution in a religiously conservative town. And you might think to yourself, oh, teaching evolution in a religiously conservative town, that must have taken, what, like 10 minutes? And when I first started what was meant to be a month worth of lessons, the kids kind of sort of, as they do, sharpened their fangs and looked at me, because they had 9 years worth of teachers that tried to teach them about evolution, and they just were primed to pounce. They were primed to just sort of jump up there and go, oh, Miss Groome, you don't know anything about evolution. Jesus says this, Jesus says that. And one thing you may not know about me, though some people do, is that I actually grew up in a fairly religious household where we spent a lot of time talking about the science versus religion debate. But it was interesting to grow up in a household of really sort of interesting deep thinkers who are also religious, is that this wasn't about science or religion. This wasn't necessarily a polarized conversation, though they, of course, were right, and I was wrong, and I was right, and they were wrong. But I spent most of my sort of influential years thinking about how we think about religion and evolution and science all in the same context. So when I sat down with my very, very smart, extremely religious students, and I said, okay, we're going to start talking about evolution, and they jumped up and they said, aha, we're going to get this, you know, brand new teacher. I also jumped up and I said, yes, let's engage in this debate. This is going to be really exciting. And so as I started teaching them, they said, oh, well, we're not going to believe your science hooey. And I was like, hey, I don't need you to believe my science hooey. I just need you to spit it out on a standardized test to show the state of New Jersey that you have learned these things. And when you start with the idea that you need to have someone spit out information on a standardized test, you can actually go pretty far with them intellectually, when all you actually have to do is demonstrate. Sorry, I'm a teacher and I have a pencil in my hair. And there's an apple in my pocket. I'm just happy to see you. Hi, husband. When you actually just have to have the kids literally spit out pre-formed answers, you have a lot of room when the kids are smart to actually get pretty in-depth with this. And we had these wonderful, just far-ranging conversations. And I actually said to them, well, so we have this BS test that you have to do, but what would your test actually look like? And they said, well, we'd like to set it up this way. And what they did was they lined up all the major tenets of evolution, of the different ways we think about evolution, the different theories and evidence and how all these things are put together in a scientific way. And they went point by point by point with Bible verses. And they said, this is why it's wrong, this is why it's wrong, this is why it's wrong. And what was so brilliant and mind-blowing to me was that They got every single piece of all these theories, all these complex ideas, these big ways that scientists think about the world. They got it so right on when they summarized it. And I kind of just took the Bible verses and I was like, yeah, I'm going to rip off that half because I don't teach a religion class. And those kids just aced that test. And so when I think about critical thinking in education, I think, one, it's really hard. But I also think critical thinking in education is about engaging kids and engaging them in how they look at the world. And again, I don't need them to believe science in the same way I don't need them to believe Euclidean geometry. It would be really great if they became engineers, that they believed in Euclidean geometry. But I don't actually need them to believe something, but I want them to fight back. I want to have kids in my classroom that when I say something, they say, They say, no way. And we engage in a dialogue about it, because that to me is what education is really about. So what we hope to do on our panel, and you'll see 3 chairs instead of 4. One of them is for me, if you want to do the math on that. Chris Emden, unfortunately, is stuck in hellish traffic coming down from Buffalo. He's made it about 10 miles out of the city limits, and I think he left at 5 o'clock this morning. So he sends his apologies, and we all feel bad that he's stuck in traffic. But what we hope to do is talk a little bit about what can schools do, the institutions of schools. What can they do in terms of teaching critical thinking? What do they do in terms of critical thinking? And what perhaps should they be doing? And what should the role of education be in terms of fostering critical thinking? And I think more importantly, what we want to talk about is really what is an engaged learner? And what does that look like when you actually have someone who knows how to disagree with you, push back, give their own opinions? So what I want to do is to introduce the panel. And because there's only 3 of us, I'm going to give the long introductions. So I want to introduce DJ Grothe. He's the president of the James Randi Educational Foundation. Come on out. He is the host of the radio show and podcast For Good Reason. He's a contributing editor to the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and he lectures and debates frequently on topics surrounding science and central beliefs at colleges and universities throughout the United States. I just said that about the For Good Reason piece. He's really wonderful, and I have enjoyed both today and last night getting to talk to him about critical thinking in education, and he's going to be talking a lot about the work that they do and what kind of critical thinking looks like in an informal learning environment. And just to give you a sense of what informal learning environments, for all of you who aren't in the jargon world that I live in, formal learning environments are schools. They're classrooms. Classrooms look very different, but they're the sort of government-run institutions of school. Informal learning environments are pretty much every place else. It's your cell phone, it's a museum, it's a club, it's your parents, it's your family, whatever it is. We sort of lump that all into the outside world, and we call it informal learning environments. I would now like to introduce Marc Barnhill. Come on out. Marc Barnhill teaches English and critical thinking at New York University and the City University of New York. He's the faculty advisor to the Bronx Community College Secular Humanist Club and an active member of New York City Skeptics and Center for Inquiry New York City. He was also named, and he actually has a plaque backstage, which is pretty shiny and cool, was named the CFI New York City's Free Thinker of the Year in February 2012. I guess it took a while to engrave his name on the plaque. He writes a blog.
It's a long name.
It's a very long name. His middle name is very long. He writes a blog at effectualagents.org and is currently writing books on critical thinking and free thought in American literature. So thank you. This is our panel. And because it's on education, it will be educational for all of you. So I'd like to start with DJ and ask, what does critical thinking look like in JREF? What does it look like in an informal environment that you guys support?
Well, it is true that a lot of our work is in the informal science or critical thinking arena. And at the JREF, that's our history the past 15, 16 years. So we try to engage the public thinking critically, especially about claims regarding pseudoscience and the paranormal, supernatural beliefs too. So we try to reach new publics through digital media, especially these days. Our YouTube channel is the 14th most subscribed nonprofit channel in YouTube history. Smartphone apps, these are all informal means of communicating to the public these sorts of critical thinking ideas. What we've begun venturing into the past couple years, as I've been aboard as president of the foundation, is seeing what resources the JREF can leverage to advance critical thinking using our background, our skill, our expertise in formal science or formal educational settings, not just science educational settings. So I'm sure as the conversation ensues, we'll chat about our curriculum modules that we're now making available to teachers throughout North America, even around the world, hopefully even translating some. So not to debunk students' belief in the paranormal, but to use the investigation of the paranormal in the classroom setting where a teacher guides an experiment about some paranormal claim tied to national science standards so that students learn critical thinking through the process of kind of skeptical inquiry in a more formalized sense. So we're trying to do both of these at the same time, informal and formal. And I guess we could talk more about that as this continues.
Well, I think as I polled the audience earlier, I think almost all of you were self-taught thinkers, and some of you learned how to learned how to think in school. So maybe you could give us a picture of what one of your lessons looks like, how a teacher actually, in an ideal world, teaches critical thinking in a classroom.
Right. Well, I really loved the opening questions. You know, most people said they're self-taught critical thinkers, and I guess we all sort of pride ourselves on that. That was my own history. I was a fundamentalist Christian. I went away to Bible college. Diderot has this line, there's nothing like a good Jesuit education to make you an atheist. I got, I think, a liberal arts education, became a skeptic, and background in magic also fueled that. So my personal path, if we want to give testimonials, isn't through some educator saying, here's how to think critically about claims. That happened in the classroom, but it was really the process of just general liberal arts education that I think encouraged me to think critically. To answer your question, imagine a teacher. So here's one of our modules. Do you have ESP? Notice it doesn't say, no, you don't have ESP, right? It's open-minded inquiry, or so we say. And imagine we have a few others, a kit where educators work with students to create their own dowsing rods and then test whether or not dowsing is real, and then tie it to real-world effects, so it's not just water witching in the backyard. We have one also tied to national science standards on the Cottingley fairies, which explores the role of celebrity in inculcating popular belief. So imagine a teacher talking about psychic powers or astrology or Cottingley fairies, one of these modules, and the students aren't told a sort of debunking answer to begin with, but instead, a lot of people believe in this stuff. Let's explore, let's see if it's real, and actually run a test like J.B. Rhine ran at Duke University using Zener cards that are supplied with the kit where teachers guide the students through this exploration, and then the students themselves get to evaluate are the results greater than chance? How do you avoid against both false positives and false negatives, et cetera? And the students at the end then conclude whether or not psychic powers are real. This raises other questions. If we're so open-minded and even-handed in the presentation of these materials, we sort of, or at least the hand-wringing at the JREF has been, do we run the risk of actually encouraging belief in the paranormal? What if there's a fluky chance event in a psychic experiment in the classroom, and a young student walks away thinking he's next in line for the $1 million challenge? So we try to balance the open-minded inquiry with, yes, some hard-hitting critical thinking in evaluating the claims as well.
I think if that happens, then you need to have another conversation about statistics and increasing your N.
Right. And I appreciate that you mentioned that. A good hunk of the Do You Have ESP module is actually, for that grade level, tied to how to crunch the statistics.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about when you were talking about the dowsing rod and the fairies and the ESP is that those are sort of cultural phenomenon, and they're not, you're not talking specifically about science, so you're talking about using scientific methods to actually pull it apart. So when you have a student that walks into the classroom and comes from a background that may be at odds with science, talking about ESP isn't attacking their beliefs.
Right.
It's actually going in and pulling something that, you know, we've all seen Paranormal Activity or any of those shows on TV. It's not necessarily aimed at one particular person.
And even if it does challenge beliefs students already have when they come into the classroom, the way we are aiming to present this isn't where we begin by telling students how they're wrong about certain beliefs, but instead we explore them. One of my favorite professors, undergrad, a psychology professor, giving offhanded advice for any of us who were ever going to become teachers. If you ever really want to grab students' attention, talk about sex or UFOs or demons, something like that, in the course of a lecture.
All together.
Exactly, yeah. Some UFO succubus or something, having a...
Demon sex succubus.
Exactly. So I think the subject matter itself, although this isn't the main point of focusing on pseudoscience and the paranormal, the subject matter itself is interesting and engaging, and it's our aim that through the exploration of those claims that we teach these methods of science attached to national science standards.
Yeah, and I'm going to just also put my hat on and pretend to be Chris for a second. One of the things that kids are asked to do frequently in science class, and it's becoming more and more of the standards of what teachers are expected to teach, are do independent research projects. And so as you're talking about this, one of the best science projects I ever saw was a kid who actually used the cards and tested with some statistical power her classmates to see if ESP was real. Another one of my favorite was a kid who tested the 5-second rule. So there's actually a place for this within the curriculum, within what teachers are supposed to be doing, and these types of activities give teachers some guidance on how to do that. Marc, I mean, you teach at the higher education level, and you teach a class on critical thinking. Could you talk a little bit more about what that's like in a university setting with older students who are more often than not choosing to take your class?
They're not, first of all.
Oh, wow. Still answer the question.
I tend to teach basic writing classes.
Okay.
And at NYU, there is actually a critical thinking program in the humanities division alongside the writing program. So students will, at some point in their first year or two of college, take Writing 1 and Writing 2 and this critical thinking course. I wound up teaching the critical thinking course because some students noticed that a lot of the stuff that I was doing in my writing courses seemed an awful lot like the stuff they were being presented with in their critical thinking course. And so when I was approached by the critical thinking staff finally, and they said, would you like to teach this course? And I looked over some of their sample materials. I thought, yeah, that does sound awfully familiar. At Bronx Community College, where I'm full-time, it's just writing courses. I usually teach developmental writing, but also just freshman writing. I also teach literature courses, but that's not that relevant here. And so I just make it a critical thinking course, basically. Like it is a critical thinking course as far as I'm concerned. That's what I teach. I tell them flat out, I'm teaching you the same course that I teach my critical thinking and writing students at NYU. And I can talk about that. But I have also taught other levels as well. I've taught middle school and high school, and I've taught 6 to 12-year-olds. And I taught a course at Kingsborough Community College in the College for Kids program a few years ago. For 6 to 12-year-olds, and the idea was that it was supposed to be academic preparation on paper, but then we were quietly told behind the scenes, it's just so the parents feel like they're getting something. You just kind of keep them busy, play a snowball paper game with them or something like that. So I taught them critical thinking skills. So with the kids, the little guys, what I mainly focused on was note-taking. I said, okay, so if on paper we're supposed to be doing academic prep, huge part of academic prep is learning how to take proper notes in a classroom, learning how do you dissect a lecture, how do you decide which information is relevant, what's worth writing down and memorizing, how do you construct knowledge. So, without my ever being this explicit about it, we were basically having a 2-week conversation with these 8-year-old kids about how is knowledge constructed, what are the different models for understanding how knowledge can be constructed, and where can you take ownership metacognitively of your own thinking about a process. Now, what I do on the college level is basically the same thing, but obviously a lot more sophisticated and also interdisciplinary.
Could you talk a little bit more about the, I don't know how many people in the audience know what metacognitive skills are, but could you talk a little bit more about the thinking about thinking that goes on in terms of actually like developing a skill set?
Well, to me, excuse me, it's warm out here. To me, I mean, there are different models that I do present to the students. You know, what is critical thinking? How is it defined? Here's these 11 ideas, or these 5 ideas, or these skills. But to me, I feel like the course is successful for a given student if the student comes away with a sense of introspection, a sense of being able to think about how she's thinking about things. What is she doing in her head? How is she processing things? An awareness from the fields of, you know, various sciences of, you know, confirmation bias and so on. How fallible are we? How susceptible are we to error? Can you trust your memory? Can you trust your judgment, your decision making, your perception? And an enthusiasm to want to be able to do these things better. And then everything else is just, you know, content and tools. So for example, in a writing class, the activities may range from presenting some art, some paintings, and using those to get into a discussion of cultural framing of issues and how culture is a very large determining factor in how we interpret values or how we interpret facts. We have on the Bronx Community College campus, we have the Hall of Fame of Great Americans, these 100 statues of presumably historically significant Americans, most of whom my students have never heard of. And so I tell them, you know, walk through here, there's 98, 102, there's roughly 100 statues in here. Write down all the ones you know, tell me what you know about them. And with the ones you don't know, let's start investigating this. Let's figure out why are these people here? Do they deserve to be here? What have they done? And by the time, you know, 2 hours later, by the time we have wound our way through this snaking Hall of Fame to the other end, usually we've had conversations about the culturally biased construction of history, what the nature of fame is. Very often, I mean, I did this with a class just a week or so ago, and we were having discussions about the theory of evolution, and you know, and how it's not the same thing as social Darwinism. And a couple of students said, "Are you serious?" And I explained what I knew about it and asked them questions, and they kind of teased out the implications of their understanding of it, and came to the conclusion at the end of that conversation, at least tentatively, that okay, this social Darwinism thing is not actually what Darwin said, and I didn't understand the theory of evolution and natural selection. Why didn't they teach me this in biology class? I said, well, you should go back and talk to your biology teacher about that. So you know, the institution, to me, the institution itself is and an English class is a perfect place to do this, is great textual material, is great fodder for sharpening your critical thinking skills. How are you being taught in your classes? What material is being presented to you? How is that material vetted? Do you believe everything your professors, are saying? Are they providing evidence, or are they just expecting you to trust them on the authority of their credentials and so on? And that sort of approach really seems to get a lot of them very enthusiastic about the idea.
Yeah, I'd like to take that class. DJ, could you talk, as you've sort of shifted into the working with teachers and preparing them to teach these lessons with the students, can you talk a little bit about what teachers are prepared to do and sort of what teachers are drawn to this, and then how successful you think the programs have been in doing that?
So we've only been at it for about a year, and the metrics are important to us as we measure exactly what you're talking about. Is it successful, or are we just patting ourselves on the back because we say we're in the classrooms, right? We sort of as part of our corporate strategy, little nonprofit, we do our annual conference, the Amazing Meeting, the largest conference of its kind in the world. We had about 1,700 people in Vegas last summer. We do it in the summer precisely to allow, especially high school teachers, but teachers of all sorts, to come to Vegas to this 4-day-long celebration of science and skepticism, because it's sort of our stated agenda to resource and educate educators to advance critical thinking in the classroom. Now, that means most of the people who download these, I wouldn't be doing my job as president of the JREF if I didn't tell you, they are available for free at randy.org. We also have printed versions. the people who download them are already sort of self-identified skeptics who happen to be teachers. And I think that's a good first goal that we're beginning to achieve. We have a database of people who fill out a sort of feedback after they use the module. And we've only been with all of our modules in about 500 classrooms so far. So that's not a ton when you think of how many classrooms are in the United States, but I think it's a good measurable first start. Those are skeptics, right? Those are, the high school science or English teacher who comes to the rah-rah tent revival of skeptics in Vegas and plugs in to the resources our foundation makes available. What we want to be able to do is, in a sort of credible way, offer these resources to all educators, even if they're not already sort of converted, right? Even if they don't use the word skeptic to self-identify. And the way, one of the strategies that we think is important in order to achieve that is to make sure that the topics and the way we present the topics are, they split the difference between kind of breadth of appeal, but it's not going to get a teacher a letter from a parent, so you won't see JREF do a module about the God delusion for youngsters, right? But
it's a great name of a curriculum.
But when evaluating claims, the things we're focusing on, astrology, where the teacher this is a module in development, we hope to have it released in the weeks ahead, where the teacher begins by drawing a contrast between true psychology tests of personality and then astrology. And gives everyone a psychology test, and everyone gets an individual reading. This is really based on the work that James Randi has done for TV and in the history of the education that we've done in the classroom. He's done for professors. And I should also say that a number of educators who are plugged into the JREF already right now teach skepticism courses even entitled Pseudoscience and the Paranormal. And they could be housed in different departments in universities. Chip Denman, who's in the audience, board member of the JREF, has taught a course along those lines for a number of years. Many other people do versions of that. And those syllabi we're going to be making available for people to plug and play with at randy.org too. But the point I was making, so an educator gives all the students a real psychology test of personality, and then talks about astrology, and then polls everyone, how accurate was your real psychology test? And it turns out, when there's the reveal, the sort of moment in the module in the classroom experience where there's the aha moment, that every student, even though they all report high levels of accuracy and individual accuracy, right, that all of them got the same personality test back. They all got the same reading. And that allows for a discussion of the Forer effect and how astrology readings that you read in newspapers are kind of form-fitting for everyone. They're general, in other words. And in other words, to get into the exploration of how those readings apply. So imagine one on psychic readings, et cetera. If it were too pointed, if it seemed like JREF was offering skeptic educators means to indoctrinate their students, I think we'd be disadvantaged. We don't want to be the alternative to our cultural competitors who offer sort of resources to teachers to advance the gospel in the classroom, right? So this is a tension we have when we develop these modules between teaching method and teaching content. And I think that bears more discussion in the whole skeptic movement. I know many educators as skeptics who really refuse in the classroom to talk about their own personal beliefs, but instead teach methods of evaluating claims and letting students arrive at their own conclusions. And so if you do that, can I say, too even-handedly, it gets back to what I mentioned earlier of running the risk of students walking away believing exactly the opposite of what you as a skeptic, best case scenario, would want them to believe.
Right. Marc, could you talk a little bit as an educator about what, when a freshman or sophomore walks into your class, sort of what the state of critical thinking is for the incoming students into your class?
Low. And I don't think that is a problem specific to any community of students. I've seen this at every level and in every community that I've taught for. The part of helping students, I find part of helping students develop an enthusiasm for critical thinking and a facility in critical thinking is first convincing them that there can be such a thing. There's a tremendous momentum I find that I'm fighting against sometimes that students, either because it's been culturally presented to them or they've just figured this out on their own somehow, that real thinking doesn't actually happen. That really, that thinking is a sort of unconscious process. It just kind of happens to you. It's this thing that's going on in your head all the time, and what are you going to do? And presenting them with the idea that, well, no, you can be metacognitive about this. You can look at your own thinking. You can examine how you're doing it. There are different ways to do it. There are better and worse ways. You can measure the results of how well you're thinking, and you can change your approach, and so on. And they don't always necessarily believe that initially. And leading them through a number of exercises and activities can slowly, in some cases not so slowly, but in most cases slowly, convince them that this is possible. This isn't beyond them. This isn't something that you need a PhD to be able to do or a lifetime of experience. That in fact, they can probably already do this a lot better than most of their friends and family members with a little bit of coaching. And that once you get the hang of it, it's not only easier than you think, it's a lot of fun and has a lot of advantages. But most students do not come in with anything like that sort of mindset about thinking about the world. The world happens to you, thinking happens inside, and you're kind of buffeted in the space in between.
Do you ever, so if kids can't opt out of your class, if kids can't opt out of your class, you have a real luxury as an educator when you get to work with kids or teachers or anybody who opts into your class. You already sort of have a group of people that want to be there. But when they can't opt out of your class, I mean, how much of your job is sort of a salesman for what you're doing, and how much of it is just sort of showing by doing?
Tremendous amount of my job is being a salesman for the cause, if you will. As I say, I'm trying to convince them that it can be done and that it's worth doing and that it's something worth integrating into your life and being enthusiastic about. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I do with my students, for example, at the beginning of each semester is after explaining briefly what's meant by critical thinking and having a conversation with them trying to tease out some of the implications about what that would mean, I give them a writing assignment, very informal. I tell them it's a diagnostic assignment, which it is. It helps me understand the state of your writing right now and how you go about constructing an essay. And I say, just answer this question. What would your life look like if you applied critical thinking to every part of it? Mm-hmm. And I get absolutely fascinating essays every semester. And then I take pieces of them, I anonymize them, and I present them as a slideshow in class the following day or week, and we discuss the implications of those. And you get this wonderful range of responses, people who are instantly enthusiastic about this and say, sign me up, that sounds great. People who insist that they already do that, thank you very much, and how dare you suggest that I don't. And invariably, those are the students who wind up, 2 or 3 weeks into the semester saying, this is really hard. I don't want to do this, this makes my head hurt. And then you get these wonderful moments of vulnerability and honesty, where students will say, I honestly don't know that I'm capable of this. I've always kind of suspected that I'm not a very good thinker, but I usually just shrug it off. And I'm worried that if I start actually trying to do this properly, I will discover that I don't have it in me. And then often along with that, to be honest, I'm very concerned about what will happen if I apply critical thinking to areas of my life where I'd rather not apply it. What happens if I stop trusting people that I have a great deal of affection for? What happens if I discover things about life or about my beliefs that don't sit well with me? what happens if the rug is pulled out from under me, sort of existentially, although they don't usually say it that way. And I tell them very honestly, like, yeah, you're right, this is a big risk. Thinking is a tremendous risk, and I'm here to tell you that it is an absolutely gorgeous and breathtaking and wonderful risk that you should dive into head first. And then it's my job to sell that for the remaining 14 weeks of the semester.
Right. I mean, you're describing a sort of breathtaking process that in some ways when you're an educator is truly terrifying when you're dealing with young minds in terms of actually sort of the trusting relationship. And it's almost easy, ignorance is bliss, right? So it's almost easier before that, sort of before the fall, essentially, when they start to happen. I'm wondering, DJ, if you have any sort of stories or thoughts about what it's like to support teachers as, so I'm very enthusiastic about this curriculum. I want to talk about this, and I want to implement it in my classroom. I'm wondering what sort of care and maintenance of the teachers along the same sort of vulnerability spectrum that Marc was talking about.
I appreciate the question, and I would also like to rejoin on the sales pitch aspect of this.
Please.
So I'll answer your question first, which is, so at the Amazing Meeting past couple years, we've offered workshops for educators who happen to be attending TAM on how to advance skepticism in the classroom. That's sort of the care and nurturing of the skeptical teacher, right? Not that in the classroom all teachers would want to be self-identified like that, because it seems a little propagandist. And there's eventually, I think there's a fine line between being the sales pitch, hey, this method of inquiry works for you and it pays off. There's a fine line between that and the propagandizing, hey, I don't believe any of the nonsense you and your parents believe, join my team. And that's, I think that's a concern many skeptic educators have, or at least they've voiced to us at these workshops and elsewhere, because I think some of it is self-consciousness that we don't want to ape our cultural competitors too much. We don't want to seem too evangelical. But also because we believe in the educative process. We believe that method trumps content, or at least if all of us don't, many of us do. I'm persuaded of that. It's sort of the Dewey approach to education. You don't get your student flip open her head and cram stuff in, but you teach a method of inquiry, she can then go and apply to everything. The big bad news is, if you're speaking in terms of the cultural competition, is that if you consistently apply this method of inquiry widely, it's necessarily going to overturn some of the most cherished beliefs everybody has. And that's why we have the culture wars in the classroom. Not only around evolution, but sex ed, or a whole, even like a secular understanding of America's founding. There's going to be this culture war going on. So about this sales
pitch.
The sales pitch notion, I think that's actually a big part of the job of organizations like the JREF and superstar science communicators. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think, is in the house, and others. Carl Sagan, back in the day, Randy for decades, and now when communicating the grandeur that is looking skeptically at things. That's a big part of our job, and it's an easy pitch to make even to youngsters when you frame it not as a way to be the smarty pants, right? But sort of as for the past few years, we've taken part in the Center for Inquiry's summer camp, skeptical summer camp called Camp Inquiry. So imagine, a week for 7 to 14-year-olds, and it's all skepticism. Randy's done it a couple years now. He's doing it again this year. I've done it a couple years before that. And the way we frame this project, not smarty pants, being all supercilious, looking down on all the nonsense believers. No, we frame it that skepticism is best self-applied. It's kind of as NPR did a feature on it, and the way we framed it in this conversation on NPR and with the students is as intellectual karate or intellectual self-defense. This gets you further in life. It's not a way to bat down other people's beliefs and tell other people another reason why they're wrong, but it's a way for you to sort of protect yourself from falling prey to the nonsense. That sales pitch is easy to make. Again, though, there's the tension between that sales pitch and then telling people everything you believe is wrong, join my skeptical movement sort of thing.
Right.
And I think that's a sort of insular or internal, inward-looking conversation the skeptics movement has been having the past couple of years,
right.
necessarily.
And you were mentioning that last night in terms of those of us in education are trying to teach a process. And so when Deborah was talking earlier about putting billboards up in communities, this idea that for educators, we don't really care what that billboard is or what the community is. We want kids to be able to look at that billboard and evaluate it and think about it and communicate around it. But we're somewhat agnostic about what the billboard should be saying and whether that billboard should penetrate it. But from what you were saying last night, it sounds like there's whatever I'm going to say this without being offensive, but I'm probably going to be offensive. I'll just talk about sex ed then, it's fine. But this idea that there's a competition from essentially jumping from one sort of fundamental position, whether that's religion or UFOs or skepticism, jumping from sort of one boat to the other.
Yeah, one doctrinaire set of beliefs to another doctrinaire set of beliefs.
Right.
And so the one thing, especially the educators tell us all the time, we have an education advisory panel with some really great skeptic educators across the United States. The conversation is often that skeptics ain't got no doctrines, right? We don't, I mean, maybe we have a worldview or a kind of a method of inquiry, but we don't have a set of beliefs. And so if you're talking to students and you're a good educator, and a student says, well, I've experienced ESP, you're not going to, you're not going to say hogwash and let me tell you why. You're going to inquire into the claim, and that's the goal of these modules and the other work we do. Maybe I'm anticipating further parts of the discussion, but when we concentrate on things like camp inquiry, it's kind of quasi between like home and, it's not a formal classroom setting, but it's structured. Mm-hmm. And these are eager young inquirers and skeptics who their parents spend a pretty penny to send them to skeptic summer camp to get into these sorts of issues. And maybe there it's a little rah-rah, and you can say, oh yeah, well, we don't believe in any of that stuff. And in fact, some of the discussions, guided discussions, are often more about the society of skepticism, right? Like, how do you feel as a 10-year-old in your classroom being skeptical of all the things your fellows aren't skeptical of? And that's a sort of engagement that would never happen in the classroom. I mean, even from a great skeptical educator, right? So there's this community aspect I think is important for us to explore as well.
Yeah, so we wanted to open it up to Q&A a little bit, but I want to ask both of you, and apologize to put you on the spot like this, but what should we be teaching critical thinking, whatever we want to call critical thinking, if it's skeptical thinking, if it's engaging students around adding these metacognitive skills, is it investigating ESP? Is that the role of the institution of schools? Is it the role of the government and the local taxpayers and the teachers and the principals? Is it the role of school to be teaching these kids or kids in general? Is it the role of that type of institution, or should we leave it up to the other institutions of the world or individuals to go out and teach it to themselves? Marc?
I'm opposed to the teaching of critical thinking in school.
You're off the panel.
I know this is a much more nuanced conversation than my immediate response is going to indicate, but what the hell else would you teach them? I mean, there's content, obviously. Am I right? I mean, obviously, we expect that students coming out of any grade level, out of a history class, will know something about the actual events and forces of history. We expect that students coming out of a science class will actually be able to identify the processes and the items of a given field of science. But we're teaching process. We're teaching, how do the acknowledged experts in this field actually do this field? What have they learned? How do they know that? So that so that presumably students could become either a contributor to that field themselves, or at least an educated citizen who understands that field, significantly enough to be able to make decisions based on the findings of that field. how could you not address critical thinking, and how could critical thinking not be the very most important topic in any course, it seems to me.
Yeah, it seems like I'm going to put my I'm Chris Emden hat on now, and within the formal education system, and when you hear about STEM education, which is sort of the big buzzword now, science, technology, engineering, and math, a lot of what we talk about, and we talk about, this goes all the way back when we were talking, originally how the Greeks talked about education of the mind as a muscle, which to a biologist is like, wait, oh, no. But this idea that education should be about teaching people how to think, learning how to learn, right? But that the place that we do that within the formal education system is science, and within the science standards, literally when DJ was talking about the National Science Education Standards, there are content and process skills in which you learn how to gather data, evaluate claims, communicate those claims. But I mean, I'll tell you that is not a historical truth over time. First off, the National Science Education Standards have not been around since that long ago, but that as part of the standards, it is a conversation, it is a debate, it is a question whether or not those process skills should be part of what is taught in science, especially when you say, well, what about evolution? What about these particular thinking, what is the difference between a theory and a law? Well, in order to teach the difference between a theory and a law, really, you actually have to talk critically about what those definitions mean, not in the sort of common vernacular language, right? So there's a real question within the education community as to whether or not, like my students who had to learn about, my poor students, who had to learn all these different things, if they just needed to spit out answers to vocabulary. This is what this means, this is what that means, these are the facts, there's no other thinking that needs to go into it. I mean, it's a real question. DJ, do you want to kind of talk about
So speaking from the perspective of the James Grandi Educational Foundation, we come down firmly on one side of that. You look at science, yes, as a body of knowledge, a collection of findings. So it's both content, yes, but from our vantage and what we do, we don't teach people science, we don't offer courses in astronomy or biology. From our vantage, what's very important is science as a method of inquiry, and even the spirit of science as a method of evaluating all sorts of claims. So is it doing science when you lift up the hood of your car or kick the tires to see what's wrong? I mean, broadly construed, you say that's the spirit of science. Maybe you're looking at evidence. And that's the sort of, and I notice in our conversation the words critical thinking have sort of been interchangeable with skepticism. That's the sort of skepticism we advance, a method of inquiry, not a content of thus saith Mr. Big or Mrs. Big Skeptic. It is true that we end up landing skeptically about these claims of the paranormal, but that's because there's a lack of evidence, not because it's doctrinaire. So we come down firmly on the in the position of wanting to advance a method of inquiry in the classroom, and that's what we're aiming to do in the classroom with the modules, but even outside of the classroom with all of the other content that we provide out there. We don't want to just be a propagandizing organization for one worldview versus another worldview. But if now I'm speaking personally, if we inculcate this method of inquiry in someone and she applies it to claims that I think are spurious, and she comes at it a different place, I think that's better, far better even, than if she doesn't know the method, but is just told that's hogwash, and she says, yes, sir, and marches on. So I think the method of inquiry really does trump the content, even though both are necessary.
Great. We just wanted to open it up to some questions for our great panel about critical thinking in education, skepticism, why the brain is not a muscle, for the chemists in the audience.
How can we impart sufficient critical thinking skills in people to overcome the bias which nature has given us, such that we can do research and find that even highly trained experts following careful rules take markedly different decisions if they take them before lunch as opposed to taking them after lunch.
DJ?
Yeah. I think it gets back to the method, and thinking of skepticism, if we're just going to focus on that word and that sort of mission, that skepticism is best when it's self-applied. So we sort of self-congratulatingly walk around and say, I'm a skeptic, therefore I'm right about this stuff. And we all suffer, people in the skeptics movement, from what I've called the Mensa effect, where a bunch of skeptics get together in a room and one person says, I'm a very smart person, I'm a skeptic, therefore I'm right about this stuff. And you guys are all smart skeptics, so you should know that I'm right about this stuff, right? So it's a sort of kind of an inherent problem with skepticism if you don't think of skepticism as best when it's self-applied. So if we learn about the brain tricks that happen even among the really smart skeptics, and we're very open about how we ourselves got duped by this or that or fooled ourselves in this other way, I think that's a good first step in laying a foundation to kind of not be susceptible ourselves.
Yeah,
don't use it as a weapon as much as you use it as a kind of self-applied or self-defense.
Yeah, I've always sort of been in awe of doctors, and when the surgeon's checklist came out, and I'm not going to remember the name of the guy who wrote that article, but was someone whispering it? Thank you. When Atul Gawande came out with the surgeon's checklist, it sort of burst the bubble a little bit for me because, I always think of surgeons as gods, because I watch Grey's Anatomy. And but I sort of realized that we all we so easily fall into the trap of if it's confirmation bias or we're tired or it's so easy to get sort of talked into an idea. And I always think that it would be really helpful for kids to have sort of a critical thinking checklist to go through and say, like, well, is it, you can tell I work with like middle and high school kids, is it because a pretty girl said it, or is it because a trusted authority figure said it, or is it because a celebrity said it, or is it because I haven't eaten lunch yet, whatever all these different things are. So I think that's helpful for people to think along a process, a somewhat rigorous process. Is there a question over here?
I just recently, I'm approaching the end of a master's in education in Massachusetts, and I just noticed a trend that I'm seeing in my experience in classrooms and my own classrooms with students. The trend to be, when we respond in class, it's very much opinion-based and it's feelings-based. And at the high school level, it's empowering to have your opinion validated just by having someone older than you or more experienced than you listen. And that persists all the way up to graduate school, at least at my institution, and it seems to be acceptable to replace critical thinking with opinion. And how can we backtrack and give these students the skills that they need to reevaluate what they've been doing for so long, rather than just keep pursuing their own interests and their own narrow opinion-based direction? I don't know how to phrase that any better, but I just want to hear you guys talk a little more about that and how it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too much into the pissing match that is academia and graduate school in terms of people picking a territory and then fighting to the death no matter how long ago it was disproven. So I think in terms of what we teach and the way we teach teachers, the education theory world is very polarized around sort of our camps. But I think in some ways for teachers, it's about taking the opinions of kids, and kids at their best are very opinionated, right? So it's about taking the opinions of kids and figuring out how to help them scaffold evidence and arguments behind it. I think we were talking earlier about engaged kids and what that looks like. I think your best student is an engaged student who's opinionated and loud and perhaps a little bit bossy, and figuring out how to go beyond the bluster especially with teenagers, and this sounds a lot like what Marc is teaching in his class, is that scaffolding to let kids say, like, it's not just about my opinion, it's a pride, and here's my opinion, and here's why I'm right in 7 different ways. And then I also think the flip side of that, and what we don't do a good job teaching kids, is listening. And I think a huge part of critical thinking is actually teaching people to listen. I spent an entire year learning how to listen, and I know that sounds really silly. But instead of having people be so sat upon their opinion that when they're listening to someone, all they're thinking about is a rebuttal, actually having the listening skills in place to be able to respond in a dialogue instead of just a constant monologue with yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to entertain multiple perspectives and weigh them and question your own assumptions is obviously fundamental to critical thinking, to skepticism, and hopefully to skepticism. It's definitely emphasized in my class. It should be in all classes, I think. I think there's an importance in drawing a distinction, a clear distinction for students between opinions and claims. If you tell me that a particular music artist is the epitome of Western civilization, that's your opinion. And you may have reasons why you feel that way, and you may want to construct an argument to persuade me to hold the opinion, but ultimately we're talking about value judgments. It's very subjective. But if you say, well, evolution isn't true and that's my opinion and you can't shake me out of it, well, now we're talking about a claim. You're making a fact claim. Now we're firmly in the realm of evidence. And claims are either true or not true. Opinions are not necessarily falsifiable in the same way. So I find that if you focus on the notion of falsifiability of claims, and when you make that clear distinction when an opinion is being offered, when a claim is being offered, students are able to take a step back and say, okay, you're right, what I just said wasn't an opinion technically, it was a claim. I still feel very strongly about it, but I recognize, because you've taught me that I need to, that I have to provide evidence for it. Here it comes. And often in the midst of them then suddenly being called upon to present the evidence, they realize, oh, I don't have it. And then you get the cognitive dissonance kick in. And so either they retreat back into, but it's my opinion, oh, wait, I can't go there, I just shut that door. What do I do now? And that's a good space to be in. It's an uncomfortable space, but if the class is... If the class has been handled well, and if the lessons have been constructed in such a way as to be supportive and not threatening, students will stay in that space for a surprisingly long time and try to find their way out of it.
Yeah, I think the trust piece that you're talking about and the vulnerability is about being comfortable with ambiguity and understanding that ambiguity is not a dead space. And it's the trust that you're talking about that gets there. DJ?
I really like this part of the conversation flowing out of that question. I mean, you're an English or you teach literature. This hasn't only been about science education, but about all the other areas critical thinking can be applied. And something that I think of in this part of the conversation is the importance of and neglect of, within skepticism, of what in rhetoric or in many English departments is called argumentation studies, right? Where there are whole courses or whole programs in not only how to evaluate claims, but how to make the best ideas win, how to provide the best warrants. And so I know few skeptics, kind of public skeptics, who are out there pushing skepticism, who are schooled in rhetoric or debate or, even what they call it in high school, forensics or something, discussion and debate, because most of us buy, as skeptics, the faith claim that all you have to do is be right? You just say the right thing and somehow that will get through. So I think one good approach, as you've touched on, and to further answer her question, how to help students not just get steeped in their opinion and say, well, this is my opinion, and sort of use the utility of reason to advance their point of view, is applying rhetoric and argumentation studies. People change their minds about central beliefs or even small claims when they focus on how to evaluate if that warrant is sufficient for the claim, as opposed to just retreating in a sort of epistemological nihilism where it's my view and who the heck are
That's
you
a really big word.
to say anything opposite.
Epistemological nihilism is a great phrase to drop into party conversation.
Yeah. Especially for this ilk. That's where I first heard it.
Yeah. Nihilism, it's exhausting.
I mean, I appreciate you. I appreciate you spotlighting the comp rhetoric angle of what I do. I mean, if I were to should have done this. If I were to photocopy and hand out to everyone here the sort of on paper description of, here are the skills and the practices that we value in our writing classes. This is what we want students to be able to do at the end of a writing course, but didn't have the title on the top saying writing course, you would all think that this was a skepticism thing that I was handing out. It's all about weighing evidence and evaluating sources and providing support and questioning assumptions and willingness to change one's mind and considering of alternatives.
And it's not only coming out of science. It's not only coming out of the science curriculum. And I think that's an important conversation for us to continue having within skepticism, because we're sort of science boosters, most of us, and we think that the answers to all these problems only come out of science. And no, I think the whole liberal arts and science curricula together sort of advance our agenda when we think of it in those terms.
They should.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say as a science teacher, there's so much. It's hard enough just to find time to teach within the day, the school day, but like seriously, as a science teacher, you're just trying to make sure kids don't light themselves on fire. I'm serious. And so the idea that critical thinking, skepticism, whatever we want to title it, lays across the entire foundation of the school day. Probably the best that I learned how to think critically was when I learned how to compare and contrast in my art history class. But that the skeptic movement would be helped along if they understood how the arts play a piece of this, how physical education, how history, and that within those disciplines, if you look at the academics or the professionals within those disciplines, each of those disciplines has a way in which they evaluate claims and build evidence and do argumentation. So that it's not just us poor science teachers, that there's a much broader piece of this puzzle that we can all be a part of and not necessarily label it skeptic or another. I want to I see there's people lining up for more questions, sorry.
I'll try to be quick. DJ, just to build off of something you were saying earlier about students leaving the classroom thinking, well, I can think whatever I want to think. It reminded me of a comment, a skeptical quote. I can't remember who it's attributed to. It's good to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Right.
But my question actually is to Marc, and you started to answer it. I teach English at a community college in Virginia, and the English faculty there were kind of split on this question of how much critical thinking to bring into the classroom, because writing instruction, they say, is so important, which it is, especially with Stanley Fish's most recent book. It's talking about this. I'm just curious, what kind of discussions have you had with the faculty where you teach? And I'm also curious what your writing assignments would look like.
Okay, so a couple of years back, in CUNY, as in many institutions, there's a major emphasis on what's called general education, these various, across-the-board skills that are supposed to be emphasized in different disciplines. And at Bronx Community College, there are 6 proficiencies that are supposed to be addressed, and different departments take ownership of one or more of these proficiencies and design their courses, presumably, to map these onto the curriculum. I was the general education fellow for the English department when we were doing this self-study. And so our department took ownership of communication, obviously, and reasoning and analysis. Reasoning analysis is critical thinking. It is skepticism. I mean, again, you can just run down the bullet points, and it could just as easily be, a program we handed out here, or a T-shirt. It could be a T-shirt. A NECSS T-shirt, the back of a NECSS T-shirt.
Front and back, maybe.
Maybe both. Yeah, it's a lot of bullets, actually.
Sleeves.
Yeah. I think I missed a part of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, this is a very subject-specific question, so maybe you guys can hook up after the panel and talk about the writing assignment piece of it.
Oh, yeah, I'll talk with you about that
over
after,
here
for sure.
Hi, I'd like to make a brief comment and then ask a brief question. Until just a couple of comments ago, recently, everyone's been talking as if science is the door to independent thinking. But I'd just like to point out that the hardest question I ever had at school was, did Stalin betray the Bolshevik Revolution? And that was a history essay question, not in science. And I think I put more thought into that than any other question ever. My question is, one does hear people who believe in telepathy and things like that say it's been scientifically proven. I don't know what they're referring to, and so just to understand the other side so one can more effectively deal with them, do any of you guys know what proofs of telepathy consist of?
Well, see, I knew you were going to ask that question.
There you go.
That's science, man.
But you haven't answered it yet.
I mean, I can just sort of speak to the way that, and I'm going to butcher this for all the scientists in the audience, but science has a way of balancing out arguments and building upon what sort of a consensus is. And the beauty of science that I don't think kids understand at all, that we don't communicate to them, is that science changes over time, that there's divergent thinking, that there's strands of thinking within science. So I think, gosh, it was at some point maybe during the SGU talk where they were, it was maybe the chicken and egg conversation, but they were at some point we were talking about, it was the placebo bracelets. You have some guy at a university doing a 10-person study where it's really not a well put together study. And then you can say, science says so. So there's a difference between what the scientific community thinks about something, understanding that the scientific community can be very diverse in its thinking, and what we just sort of make as these sort of pop culture claims that science says. So I know there's been a lot of really interesting work around these questions in Eastern medicine. Acupuncture, yoga. There was just does yoga lead to pain relief? Well, I tell you, when I do yoga, I feel better. But so there's a rigorous process that it needs to go through, especially around the biomedical stuff, that I think is an interesting place to look for that.
Specifically on the question there, I believe, am I thinking Cornell? But Daryl Bem is a researcher at Cornell who seemed to come out with a study that suggested some form of precognition. And it hasn't been able to be replicated, but it's touted by believers a lot. And there are a lot of these studies in what we would call the pseudosciences. So it's not that the studies don't exist, it's that the community of scientists find them lacking. So you can cherry pick and find a study that proves just about any claim. The question is, can you find consensus about the study? And that would be a response the questioner would want to give to some claimant who says, but doesn't science prove telepathy?
So we have time for one more question.
I was wondering, given the evidence that we've learned today that most of us are self-taught in our critical thinking skills, and I would extrapolate to say that most of us are self-taught as adults, and or a developed age where we could self-teach ourselves these things. I was wondering what the panel thinks is the youngest age that you think that we should start approaching teaching critical thinking. How young is too young?
I would say that kids are born critical thinkers. Or at least experimenters around the world around them, right. And it's actually the process of formal education that often beats it out of them. So I would, and I have citations for that because it's part of my dissertation. So that it's a process of fostering and nurturing, not necessarily a process of how early, because I think there's a lot that's coming out about very, very early learners and their ability to deal with abstraction that's pushing the boundaries of what we think about early learners.
I don't think any age is too early. I mean, I have a 3-year-old, and I would say that he and I have critical thinking-based conversations all the time. I don't, do theory with him or anything, but he's
maybe next year.
He's smart and he's curious and he asks questions and he tries to figure things out. And I suggest ridiculous alternatives to him in very serious voices, and he gives me very clear reasons why that doesn't make sense. And then sometimes I present the actual explanations in the same exact voice, and he says, "No, that's silly," and then thinks about it and he works it through. It's never too early. I mean, again, what the hell else would you do with a kid?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Coming out of the developmental psychologists, there's a lot of interesting work on children, not as critical thinkers, but as inquirers. Like, wow, why is the sky blue, Daddy, et cetera. And I don't know why I'm picking on Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he tells this great story about how one of his children just flipped over a glass of milk at the dinner table to see what would happen. And there's this big mess, and your first instinct as a parent is to, oh my gosh, look at the mess you're making. And of course, the very cool Neil deGrasse Tyson just nods and smiles, just enjoys that moment of discovery. So I think I agree, never too young. And there are more resources now for parents to plug in and get involved in inculcating this sort of spirit of inquiry than ever before. So if you're a parent or an uncle or an aunt, avail yourself of the resources, not only the summer camps, but like at the Amazing Meeting this year, we have both child care and programming for children for the first time in the history of TAM. The modules, all of that. So use the resources.
Yeah, well, so on behalf of myself, I would like to thank the panel for a really wonderful conversation, and thank you.